Hello, thank you very much for joining us today at this Asia-Pacific Development Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue event, looking at what does it look like for Australia to enhance coordination with France in the Indo-Pacific. My name is Melissa Conley-Tyler. I'm the Executive Director of AP4D, and I'm joining you today from the land of the Ngunnawal people in the high country of New South Wales. I pay my respects to elders past and present and welcome any Indigenous people joining us today. And we will be having a bit of a discussion in the paper about the role of First Nations, foreign policy, and that Australia has adopted in forming greater links in the Pacific. So thank you so much for joining us today. We are absolutely delighted that we have such a great group of people who have come. I think we have over 100 people who have registered to join us, either to watch now or to watch later at their convenience. And it's great to have people from across all of the Ds, defence, diplomacy and development, plus the things that don't start with D, like law, trade, economics, law enforcement, etc. So this paper that we're looking at, the reason AP4D looked at it is, we're conscious that in a difficult and contested world, you need all of the elements of statecraft working together. We think this difficult strategic environment makes a great reason for Australia to form effective partnerships. Now, in this case, I think France has many things that suggest that it can be an effective and useful partner for Australia in the Indo-Pacific. There are also some barriers and challenges in doing that. And so the idea of the paper is to take us through, in this strategic environment we live in, what are some of the ways that Australia and France can enhance their coordination. Now, what we're going to be doing today is I'll tell you a little bit about AP4D first. We're still very new. We've only been going under 2 years, and so it's worth me quickly introducing. Then you can hear a bit about the process that produced this paper from Hugh Piper, our program lead. We then have a fantastic panel of experts from the working group who put this paper together. They'll tell you more in more depth what came out of it for them. So a big welcome to all of them for joining us, to Kate O'Shannessy from the Perth US Asia Centre, from Energy Bear, who I saw just last week in the Pacific, and from Natalie Sandby from Verve Research. And then we have a special guest to finish us off. We're delighted to welcome Zoe McKenzie MP, the member for Flinders, who is also the Deputy Chair of the Parliamentary Friends of France Network. And she'll be giving us a bit of a policymaker's response to what's in the paper. So just to kick us off with a quick introduction to AP4D and what we are. We are very much a platform for collaboration, and I think you can see that in the people who are involved. So we have a fantastic advisory group made up of our co-chairs, Mark Purcell and Michael Wesley, and I welcome you on their behalf, and fantastic people from across each of the sectors. Even better somehow, we managed to get some early funding to make this a reality. So the Australian Civil Military Centre came on board, gave us a first year's seed funding to work on bringing together working groups of people from across the different sectors. And through that, we've now produced, I'm going to say, a host of papers. We produced papers looking at Australia's key relationships in the Pacific, our key relationships in Southeast Asia, and then this year, in our second year, now joined by DFAT, Office of the Pacific and Southeast Asia Maritime as a funder, we've been producing more and more papers on topics from women, peace and security in the Pacific to illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing and our relationship with Timor-Leste. So what you're going to hear today is about our paper, which is looking more specifically on the Australia-France relationship. And this is one that's been funded by the Australian Civil Military Centre. So I'm going to turn over to Wayne Snell to ask him to say a few words about ACMC and why it supports us. And at the same time, can I thank the director of ACMC, Nicola Rosenblum, and Jules Frost, who's been one of the working group members who's contributed to this paper. Over to you, Wayne.
Thanks very much, Melissa, and good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of ACMC, I just want to give you a bit of an idea about what we do and why we do it, and why it is that we think that AP4D is actually important, particularly for a small organisation like ours. So for those of you who don't know anything about ACMC, we're a small unit inside of Defence, but we have a whole of government remit, and that remit extends actually beyond government and includes being able to work with the humanitarian sector and enabled to do that. We were established in 2008 as a result of some fairly forward thinking about how Australia as a nation works towards trying to achieve its national interests. Rather than just the single government departments, and then trying to get some not only synergy but interoperability and the integratedness, which we have seen from some of the other countries and the way in which they work, particularly overseas. But our primary role is to support and develop national civil police capabilities to prevent, prepare and respond more effectively to disasters and to conflict. And it's an interesting space because we're quite unique in that we sit inside the fence, but take taskings and have contributions that extend well beyond the fence. We work in contexts where there are no easy answers, and where the idea of the range of stakeholders and the range of influences, the changing environment is always placing policy position on the back foot, so to speak. We're always trying to work towards trying to keep it ahead of it. Quite difficult to do. Part of the way that we do that is to actually work with a whole bunch of international counterparts that work in this field. Again, not only the government ones, but the non-government sector as well, and try and come up with a position where and come up with strategies and support policy options, which of course is where we are today, to try and help Australia achieve what its objectives are. Our success, when people ask me, well, how do you measure success in this space? It's actually quite difficult. But basically it's measured by how well Australia actually mobilises all of its national efforts. And I use that term very deliberately, all of its national efforts, to promote things like resilience and peace, security, stability, and how it also works with its friends and its neighbours. That's also one of the key measures for us about how well we're actually going as an organisation. So mostly, I would suggest we don't own anything, but we contribute to a lot and we support a lot, that individually and at agency level to country level. So that gives you an idea about who we are and what we do. In relation to AP4D, this presented an opportunity for us when this project was first brought to us, and I was there at the start. I was one of the supporters for this, and ended up actually with the fantastic opportunity to manage the project from this side. Was to be able to drive that idea that there is this whole of government, this whole of whole effort, rather than simply individual silos of effort that we had seen. Particularly, as we could see on the horizon, the development of defence as a particular lead in this space, particularly for the last couple of years in the last government, where defence was being seen as a lead, and to make sure that all of the efforts were actually brought forward together, and that opportunities to present all of Australia's interests in that space. The AP4D then created the vehicle for that, which was fantastic for us to come on board early, and that's the reason why we're still in this space. And it also gave us the opportunity to use some very talented and very committed people who were quite keen to share not only their interests and their expertise, but also share some of the challenges with others, to be able to put forward some policy options for some of the questions, some of the vexed questions that ACMC had actually been involved with and that we've been chasing. So I commend the work of AP4D to you. And for those of you, again, who haven't had much to do with ACMC and you want to find out a little bit more, in the chat, there's a link there for our website. So thanks very much, Melissa. And I look forward to hearing the roundup from the latest paper.
Thank you so much, Wayne, for those really kind words. And yeah, it's always fantastic to hear about the great work that ACMC does. My name's Hugh Piper. I'm a program lead at AP4D, and it's been my pleasure to, I guess, shepherd this process through over the last few months. I'll really quickly outline, I guess, the process that sat behind this paper, the kind of key findings and pathways or recommendations that it makes, so that everyone has, I guess, a broad sense and understanding of what the paper's about. We'll then flip into a panel discussion that I'll chair, but really drawing on some of the expertise that fed into this paper. And then there'll be an opportunity for Q&A from the audience towards the end of that panel. So please start, thinking about your questions that you might like to ask, and feel free to use the Q&A function on Zoom as well for that. So this has been a process over the past 4 to 5 months or so of the usual AP4D process of developing dialogue on an iterative basis from a kind of initial scoping dialogue level through a more kind of structured and focused working group process and consultation with relevant stakeholders and experts. We started with a public dialogue back in February that I'm sure many of the people that are attending here today came along to as well, and we were lucky to have the French ambassador to Australia speak at that event as well around France's priorities in this part of the world. From that then constructed a working group of 11 experts who sort of cover off on different dimensions of the role that France can play alongside Australia in this part of the world. We're fortunate to have 3 of those people actually joining us in the panel shortly. But this was really a huge team effort, not just from the working group, who I guess played an ongoing consultative role, but we also held consultations that were led by Anna in the Pacific, with 10 people with experience engaging both Australia and France to kind of bring that direct Pacific perspective on this question of Australia-France. And we also held other consultations with Australian and French officials, and also other Australian and French experts in various ways who contributed to the paper. So what I'll do now is just step through some of the kind of key conclusions at a really high level. There's a lot of detail and a lot of sort of research that sits behind all of this. So I obviously encourage you to read the paper in full, but I'll give you I guess a taste of some of the key points that we make. So at the overarching level, why is this a really important issue that needs to be, I guess, addressed or tackled right now? So I think it's fair to say that the Australia-France relationship is very much in a rebuild phase, but it is in a positive trajectory at the moment. We see the bilateral roadmap between Australia and France, which will be the kind of primary bilateral architecture, is currently being developed between the two governments. So now is a kind of key moment to help kind of influence the thinking and the trajectory of the relationship. This report is the first major one that's been developed on Australia-France ties since the AUKUS announcement in September 2021. So it's a really important opportunity to, I guess, commentate on, but then also suggest kind of positive pathways that can be taken by Australia to re-engage France. We've seen this through the sort of building momentum at a political level between the Prime Minister Albanese and President Macron, but also in the 2+2 Defence and Foreign Ministers consultations earlier this year. There are really strong indications that France is looking to and will boost its contributions and presence in the Indo-Pacific, right across diplomacy, development, and defence. So now's a really important moment for Australia to be thinking about how it can best influence and work with France in that context. And this is all part of, I guess, that broader, imperative for Australia to coordinate effectively, both bilaterally and multilaterally, with countries like France to enhance the effectiveness of our respective contributions in the region. I won't go through all of this in detail. There's a lot of detail here. But one of the key sort of pieces of research that we did as part of this paper was to, I guess, map the existing baseline contributions that Australia and France make in the region across, diplomatic presence in terms of number of diplomatic posts, development contribution in terms of ODA spending, and also permanent military presence of Australian and French forces. I guess the key takeaway here at a kind of zoomed out level is to say that Australia is a significantly greater presence and contributor in the Pacific. In Southeast Asia, things are, I guess, more evenly balanced in terms of diplomatic presence and development contribution. And then in the Indian Ocean, and in particular in the Western Indian Ocean island states, France has a much greater presence in diplomatic and development terms than Australia. And that kind of symmetry or asymmetry in some ways presents opportunities for Australia and France to think about who can lead and who can make greater respective contributions in each space in terms of coordination. One of the other important, I guess, research exercises that we undertook was to map the existing, I guess, avenues or mechanisms for cooperation, collaboration, and coordination between Australia and France in the Indo-Pacific. Again, there's a lot of detail here. Wouldn't expect anyone to be able to read it all, but very much I'd encourage you to go through it with a fine-tooth comb in the context of reading the report. But what we've sought to do here is capture the kind of shared forums, bilateral agreements, territories, and diplomatic missions of Australia and France in the region. And we can see that there's already existing, significant coordination, and that builds on, I guess, building and pretty strong overall bilateral ties between Australia and France. I'd say that Australia-France coordination is most institutionalised in the Pacific and less so in Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. Many-lateral dialogues are a key feature across the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. In the Pacific, that's with New Zealand in the context of the FRANZ arrangement, but also with the United States in the context of the Pacific Quadrilateral. And in the Indian Ocean, there's obviously the trilateral dialogue between Australia, India, and France. In terms of existing areas of coordination, we see that humanitarian and disaster relief, maritime security, and military exercises are common features of existing Australia-France coordination in the region. So in terms of some of the risks, barriers, and challenges that we see that Australia really needs to confront along with France in order to kind of make the most of the relationship in this part of the world. There's obviously the kind of context of the kind of ongoing bilateral relationship recovery since AUKUS. Things are on a positive trajectory, and I think trust has been rebuilt remarkably quickly since 2021. But nonetheless, it's still in important context for Australian policymakers to keep in mind. It's also important to view France's Indo-Pacific engagement in the context of its global commitments, priorities, and resources. France is a P5 and a G7 power. It has significant stake in contributions towards North Atlantic security. Obviously, Ukraine is occupying a lot of its attention at this particular point in time, as well as ongoing commitments in Africa. And all of that has impacts on and affects the extent to which France can and will commit to the Indo-Pacific. There's also, this broader problem that I touched on before around coordinating with France in that kind of context of aligning contributions from various actors, whether that be the United States, India, Japan, other European actors, etc. And we need to be mindful of how, different actors can contribute in a deconflicted and effective way. Australia also faces challenges around sort of understanding at a really deep level, French strategic culture and strategic outlook. It's really important that Australia, invest in developing a more nuanced understanding of French strategic culture and outlook. And finally, there are barriers and there are, I guess, challenges and risks for Australia in engaging with France, in particular in the Pacific context. France does have a colonial history in this part of the world. There are obviously ongoing sovereignty issues surrounding its territories in the Pacific, and there's also the memories of nuclear testing in the South Pacific as well. And they're all, I guess, risks that Australia needs to continue to manage in the nature and extent of its engagement with France. So the overarching vision for what we want to see from the Australia-France relationship going forward is that we want to see Australia capitalise on that current positive trajectory of bilateral relationships to build a resilient, long-term constructive relationship with France. In the Indo-Pacific, that means that the relationship becomes more mature and it sort of develops on a kind of really pragmatic basis of mutual understanding and having a clear sense on the Australian side and the French side of where cooperation and coordination will be most productive. In the Pacific, we want to see, from an Australian perspective, we'd want to see an expanded French presence that makes constructive, long-term and consistent contributions to addressing the region's key challenges. And on HADR, we'd really like to see the FRANZ arrangement continue to be an important and valuable coordination mechanism. In Southeast Asia, it's a more opportunistic point of view for Australia. We want to see Australian officials alert to opportunities to coordinate with France, including in ASEAN forums and on issues such as human rights and maritime security. And we also want to see the potential for trilateral exchanges between Australia, India, Indonesia, and France explored. And then in the Indian Ocean, we'd want to see the Australia-India-France trilateral dialogue continue to grow. And we'd also want to see Australia leverage its ties with France, including in areas such as maritime security and safety, where we can make the most of contributing to French and EU-led efforts. So what does this look like at a more practical level? So there's kind of 4 categories or groups of pathways or recommendations that we make through this report. At that kind of overarching Indo-Pacific level, we emphasise that Australia really needs to make sure that the bilateral roadmap is focused on leveraging greater French contributions in the Indo-Pacific in the context of the broader bilateral relationship. We say that Australia should be working really closely with France to influence European engagement in the Indo-Pacific, and that includes, in particular, on infrastructure finance and making sure that the EU Global Gateway Fund of 300 billion euros is as much directed towards this part of the world in a productive way. We also think that there's an opportunity to work with France on the application of France's feminist foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific and how that might sit alongside Australia's own gender equality priorities. And we also think that there's an opportunity to enhance the Australian government's own France literacy and capability for coordinated engagement. Zooming in on the Pacific in particular, this is all about realising the benefits of greater coordination with France. So at a top level, we want to see deeper coordination with France right across development, diplomacy and defence. And we also want to see Australia encouraging greater contributions by France, to addressing key regional challenges. In particular, we want to see, the bilateral coordination and multilateral coordination involving Australia and France on development policy continue to grow through various mechanisms. We think that humanitarian assistance through the FRANZ arrangement could continue to be optimised. It's already been a really strong and important arrangement in this part of the world, but I think there's an opportunity for Australia, France and New Zealand to, step back and think about how to further grow and build this arrangement to be effective. And finally, we want to see First Nations and Indigenous engagement with people in French Pacific territories continue to grow even further. And there could be opportunities to enhance this through practical steps, such as opening up access to the Pacific Labour Mobility Scheme to people from New Caledonia, and also for scholarships and more people-to-people engagement. In Southeast Asia, as I mentioned before, it's a more kind of opportunistic situation. So Australian officials should be pursuing opportunities for ad hoc coordination and collaboration where it really makes sense to do so and where interests and capabilities intersect. But exactly what those opportunities are kind of remains to be seen. We also think that there's potential in a trilateral dialogue and practical cooperation between Australia, Indonesia and France. That doesn't have to be at a kind of leaders or ministerial level necessarily. It could be at a lower level, but we already see that there's the 3 bilateral relationships within that trilateral are already strong, and there could be scope for greater work in the maritime domain in particular. And then finally, in the Indian Ocean, we want to see Australia continue to invest in the Australia-India-France trilateral dialogue and really capitalise on the political momentum that sits behind it at the moment, and really build out the kind of practical cooperation, especially in the maritime domain, in areas such as humanitarian and disaster relief, and in other areas such as undersea cables or oil spill warnings. And we also think that in the Western Indian Ocean, so the island states on the eastern coast of Africa, there's opportunities for Australia to, I guess, leverage French advantages and capabilities in that part of the world. And that can be in maritime security, maritime safety, potentially even in areas around capacity building in those areas, and potentially also in disinformation. So that's a very quick kind of 40,000 feet view or scan of the key points in this report. I now want to bring in our panelists. So I've got Natalie Samby from the research. We've got Kato Shaughnessy, who's the research director at the Perth US Asia Centre. And we've got Anna Joubert, who's an international development consultant with a focus on the Pacific, and in particular who led the Pacific engagement and consultation as part of this report. As I flagged, we'll start with, I guess, a few questions that we've got prepared, but then I'll open it up to Q&A in a little bit as well. So please, everyone in the audience, start thinking about your burning questions that you want to answer, that you want answers to, and feel free to pop that into the Q&A, and we'll try and get to as many of them as possible. So in terms of questions, if I could start with you, Anna. Sorry to put you on the spot first up. You've got considerable experience working in the Pacific, in particular in Francophone contexts. You're the resident French speaker on this project as well. And you obviously led the Pacific Voices component of this paper, speaking to leaders in Vanuatu, Tonga and Fiji who have experience engaging both Australia and France. I guess, what do you think are the most important priorities for Australia in engaging France in the Pacific? And in particular, what did the Pacific Voices tell us about their priorities in working with both Australia and France?
Thanks, Hugh. Well, I think, clearly what came out from Pacific Islander colleagues was the core message that Australia needs to capitalise on the more conducive environment for greater coordination with France, both from the lens of the importance of a deeper allyship with a like-minded rules-based power, but also from the lens of building greater trust and credibility with Pacific Islander partners. In the context of increasing geostrategic competition in the region, the Pacific Voices really made it clear that their countries are not to be framed as a theatre for others' interests and relational machinations, but rather their interests need to be a central consideration within these processes. And clearly this more respectful consultative intent will also pay off in terms of increased returns in political and diplomatic influence. And at the heart of this was a real call for practical action that goes beyond the rhetoric of donor coordination, donor harmonisation within well-meaning policy statements and pledges. The lack of such cooperation mechanisms at the country level, as currently perceived, needs to be urgently addressed. And in relatively small island states where there aren't huge logistical impediments to regular streamlined channels of communication. And this is not only to enhance the aggregated effectiveness of Australia's and France's interventions, but also to signal an acknowledgement of the burden and indeed harm caused by blinkered, siloed, overcrowding approaches, particularly in the sphere of development cooperation, which also is hindered by the prevalent monolingualism of both donors. But I think the paper really usefully indicates very concrete entry points for improvements in this regard, including country-level coordination, forums and conferences, greater visibility and mapping of respective contributions, alignment on compliance requirements, dedicated resources for coordination. But the divergent operational cultures of both countries were widely commented on by the range of Pacific stakeholders, but also, as you mentioned, the positive foundations and models that can be built upon, in particular, one of those being the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief coordination through the FRANZ arrangement with New Zealand. That was most recently in evidence in response to the dual cyclone Judy and Kevin in Vanuatu early this year. But the level of cooperation displayed and appreciated at this time really seemed to stand in stark contrast to what the norm is that is perceived to be during non-crisis times. So this is clearly an opportunity where systems of communication and joint action can be further optimised and expanded. But it should be noted that the Pacific leaders really underscored the need for significant improvement in working through existing local structures and institutions under local guidance and leadership, and more consistently informed by political economy analysis and on-the-ground intelligence. So yeah, just in brief, they were the kind of the key takeaways that our Pacific respondents conveyed.
Thanks so much, Anna. That was a really excellent summary in a very, very quick time as well. And again, I'd encourage, if people want to, I guess, ask Anna in particular some deeper points on that kind of Pacific piece, please feel free to pop questions into the Q&A. Natalie, I might come to you next. So you're an expert on Southeast Asia as well as the broader kind of security environment in the Indo-Pacific. The paper discusses opportunities for France to coordinate and align with France in Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, in particular in the maritime domain. What do you see as kind of the key opportunities for Australia to work with France in those parts of the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. I think the first and probably the most important point is that Australia and France develop a common operating picture of the Indo-Pacific and deciding what kind of order that we want to shape and strengthen. And I say that because our Foreign Minister Penny Wong is using this language at the moment of strategic equilibrium. If we listen to the speeches at the Shangri-La Dialogue of Southeast Asian leaders, they talk often about non-alignment and a dynamic equilibrium as well. And it's timely now that President Macron has adopted this idea of puissance d'équilibre. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there to work past this sort of block mentality, as it's put. We work through multipolarity, and certainly working with countries like Indonesia, not only because it's the leader within Southeast Asia, within ASEAN, but also because Australia, France, and Indonesia are actually the three countries within the Indo-Pacific that are both Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean states as well, that they straddle or they have territories in both those sides. So I think thinking about those opportunities and becoming much more dynamic and active about shaping the order that we want, and that common operating picture is the first most important point. And engaging other burgeoning economies and rising middle powers in Southeast Asia, that looks like Vietnam, Philippines, which is a frontline state when it comes to friction with other rising powers, and states like Singapore that has the capacity to support the kinds of maritime security, maritime domain awareness capacities that we are looking for. Other areas of practical cooperation within ASEAN, I think, have to start with ASEAN-centric issues. So we need to look at two things. First and foremost, ASEAN-centric regional architecture. So now that France is a working group observer of ADMM+, that could be another area that we would deepen, perhaps have consultations in a preparatory style before going off to ADMM+. But the other thing is, besides regional architecture, which is ASEAN-centric, working on ASEAN-centric issues. And now that France is a development partner of ASEAN, thinking much more about infrastructure development, so things from ASEAN's perspective, economic growth, health security, human resources development, and things even like media training and investment in scholarship. I say that because within the Indo-Pacific, and particularly in certain Southeast Asian states, we observe trends of rising authoritarianism and increasing illiberalism. And so it's critical that we, as liberal democracies, France and Australia, we look at supporting issues like a free and open press and the ability to document history and promote accountability. So again, those are very practical areas where I think France and Australia can support. So just deepening some of those areas of our paper. But there is one interesting thing I want to raise about the issue of ASEAN centrality. I think France and Australia should decide, when is ASEAN centrality critical and when do we abandon it? On what issues is it necessary that we uphold ASEAN centrality, but on what issues do we apply, or do we consider an ASEAN minus X issue? And maybe working out those issues ahead of time before we go to engage ASEAN might actually help Australia and France coordinate a little bit better. So particularly things like Myanmar, you know, how is France going to work towards becoming a dialogue partner without thinking ahead about some of the trickier stuff? And then, so that's a lot about the big picture stuff and the practical areas of cooperation. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper about how we're going to do this and with whom. And so I would propose that France and Australia look at maximizing interfaces in Southeast Asia with bureaucracies, bureaucracy to bureaucracy, academia, civil society, and like I said earlier, the media, developing things like multi-agency working groups, as we said earlier, HADR, climate change, maritime security, but also trying to infuse not just people-to-people ties, but cultures of bureaucracy, promoting accountability and transparency as well. Particularly in Myanmar, looking at working at non-governmental actors such as civil society, I think is really important. And in the very practical sense, how do we do that? 1.5 track mechanisms, track 2 dialogues, these kinds of exchanges, I think would go a long way. So lots to chew over, but certainly just deepening what we've mentioned already in the paper. But yeah, happy to take further questions.
Thanks so much, Natalie. And yeah, just encourage people again, if you really want to kind of follow up on or come in sort of deeper on any of these questions and issues that have been raised so far, please feel free to jump into the Q&A. So Kate, I'll come to you now. So in your diplomatic career in DFAT, you worked in various Francophone contexts in Paris, West Africa, and indeed most recently as High Commissioner to Mauritius and Seychelles, and Ambassador to Madagascar and Comoros. In this paper, we identify the Western Indian Ocean region as a sub-region in the Indo-Pacific where Australia could, I guess, boost its contribution, especially considering Australia is hosting the Indian Ocean Conference in 2024 that the Assistant Foreign Minister recently announced. It's also pursuing bids to host COP31 and to hold a UN Security Council seat. I guess, what do you see as some of the key opportunities and priorities in the Indian Ocean to work with France and potentially also the EU?
Thanks heaps, Hugh, for the question. I would definitely say, as an Australian ambassador to the tiny Western Indian Ocean island states, you become a real expert in managing expectations. And so maybe before I answer the question about what are the priorities, maybe I'll take it back a step and actually say why, because it's not immediately obvious, especially to an Australian foreign policy community, why Australia should be thinking that far west of the Indian Ocean. And it really comes back to the same question that all of our speakers talked about and that Melissa framed the discussion at the start of this session, which is about geostrategic competition. So we know that that's happening in the Pacific. We know that that's happening in the Northeast Indian Ocean. There wouldn't be a person on this call that doesn't know about the Chinese 99-year lease on the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. But that engagement on the part of China is actually happening around the whole Indian Ocean rim in all sorts of places that probably many of the people on this call have never even heard of. So China has had a deal with Comoros to build a port there, which ultimately was overturned, and a French company's now building the port there. It's built a port in Madagascar. It's built ports or expanded port facilities across the east coast of Africa, including a recent deal that was only recently scotched by the Tanzanian government, which would have given China access to a 900-kilometre stretch of coast that excluded any other party, including the Tanzanian government, from building a port there. It's got a military base in Djibouti, which it opened up in 2016. So the same kinds of behaviours and strategic objectives that we worry about in the Pacific are also happening in the Indian Ocean. It's dominating the provision of undersea cables. China in the Western Indian Ocean, for example, has an embassy on every single tiny island. The only other country to have that kind of presence is France. So if Australia is thinking about what is happening to the strategic balance in a region that backs up against the entire third of Australia, the Defence Strategic Review asks us to think about our northern approaches and our defence of the western third of the country. We really need to be thinking about who can we work in the region that understands the region. Obviously, India is one of those partners, actually, in addition to France. The challenge for India is that it's facing a pretty aggressive disinformation campaign from China in the Western Indian Ocean, as well as in other parts of the Indian Ocean Rim region. So those partnerships with countries like France, who we might be able to work with on those issues like disinformation, on issues like submarine cables, they're actually really important if we're thinking about what a region that is close to us is going to look like in 10 years or 20 years' time. I think one of the things that your paper does really well is flag, I guess, the limits of some of our partnerships and the limits of French interest. It's really important for us to figure out where our interests intersect. I think the paper does well to mention the primacy of French interest in Africa. In West Africa alone, France has hundreds of thousands of citizens. A major French company operates the only uranium mine in the impoverished nation of Niger, which provides a large chunk of French electricity. So we need to really kind of go in eyes wide open, understanding that France has other interests and they're not always the same as us. But the key issues that your paper identifies, I think, are areas that interest both France and Australia. So the submarine cables, the disinformation, maritime domain awareness. It's important to note France and India are already working together on those issues in the Indian Ocean, and Indian P8s, maritime surveillance aircraft, land regularly on Reunion Island. And then the broader question of freedom of navigation and access to the Indian Ocean for trade. So I think those 4 areas that your paper identifies really, to me, are where French and Australian interests intersect in the Indian Ocean, but they go to the broader question of as Natalie mentioned, the kind of order that we want to create across the Indo-Pacific. Super happy to take questions, but those are the big picture issues.
Thanks so much, Kate. And I think you provided an excellent strategic overview there in 5 minutes or less, which is better than I think anyone else could manage. So thank you so much. I'm going to ask one more question and then we might throw open for the Q&A. And it's a question, I guess, to everyone on the panel, and they should feel free to sort of jump in or whatever. But, you know, I've sort of mentioned already the scope for what the future of Australia-France relations looks like, obviously comes in, or for coordination in this part of the world, obviously comes in the context of the bilateral relationship between Australia and France more broadly. This is the first major report on Australia-France ties since the sort of disruption that was caused by the AUKUS announcement. And I guess, how would you characterise Australia-France relations now? And I guess, what does that mean for the future going forward between Australia and France in the Indo-Pacific? I'm really happy for anyone to jump in who wants to take a stab at that.
I can kick off really quickly. Just from my perspective, I work mostly on sort of strategic and defence policy issues, looking at the kind of literature that's emerging in my field, particularly think tank reports coming from places in Paris like IFRI. It seems like there is a genuine desire to move things forward and talking about sort of a post-AUKUS bilateral relationship in constructive terms. So I think that's really good. And obviously the cultural relationship remains strong. If we're going to look about the future of Australia, France within the Indo-Pacific, talking from a Southeast Asia perspective, I personally would like to see a bit more investment in sort of boosting our shared cultural understanding of Southeast Asia. So looking about investing in promotion of Southeast Asian literatures, I think in each of our respective countries might be something novel to think about if we're going to be working much more closely in that part of the Indo-Pacific.
Maybe I'll jump quickly on Indian Ocean. I mean, my experience kind of working across Africa and the Indian Ocean is that Australia is always like the little partner and in some ways the mendicant, because we don't have the same expertise that France has in those parts of the world. So I think, especially in the Indian Ocean, we really have to go to the French with a good pitch about why it matters for both of us. Some of those pitches are very much in your paper, so I actually would really strongly recommend those avenues of inquiry to colleagues on the line that are calling in from DFAT and government.
And maybe Hugh, just to jump in specifically from the Pacific Islander perspective, yes, of a real sense of optimism of this increasing goodwill and the benefits of that, particularly with regard to the like-mindedness and joint action on addressing climate change in evidence-based ways. But there was a real concern, particularly from Melanesian colleagues, around that area of potential divergence that you highlighted, which, was a real sense of distrust around France's colonial history and ongoing sovereignty over parts of the Pacific, which was felt to misalign with Australia's really increased agenda on localization, local leadership, First Nations foreign policy, and how that would be married.
No, thanks, Anna. I think that's a really good point. And that probably makes a pretty good segue into a couple of questions that have come through. Nick McClellan has asked 2 questions. I might put them together for the sake of time and because they sort of bounce off one another. So the first question is, given that there are sort of independence parties in both New Caledonia and French Polynesia, sort of why is the Australian government reluctant to address France's decolonisation obligations as an administering power? And I'll just put that together with Nick's second question around, in the context of those sort of non-self-governing territories, or the territories in the Pacific in particular, what can Australia do potentially through scholarships or ODA or cooperation through regional organisations to deal with local governments in those territories? Anna, did you want to come in on that first, or?
Sure. I mean, I don't think I can really speak on behalf of the Australian government.
Sure.
So.
Yes, I should say none of us can, obviously.
But I do think the point around scholarships is really well made, and I think the paper really highlights that as a real opportunity and entry point for ODA and then the development program. It really has been in those parts of the Pacific, really completely neglected, actually. And so in terms of that, as you're saying, local leadership, governance, people-to-people links, I think that really is the entry point, and certainly something that Melissa was referring to the Pacific Update conference, and certainly a conversation that I was having with people in DFAT, that is the whole expansion of the scholarships program, and geographically as well, being really on the agenda. So I definitely think that is something to explore. Obviously, yes, I would imagine Australia is going to be walking very carefully around the issue of of sovereignty in the Pacific, but I think that's just something that we just have to be really cognizant and lucid about, that there are just going to be areas that are not going to be seen as priorities for engagement, and there'll be definitely picking of battles for strategic interest.
Natalie, Kate, did you guys want to come in on that, or?
I'll just make a brief comment on the non-ODA question for scholarships to French territories. Obviously, one of my many roles in DFAT many years ago was running the aid budget. And obviously, you're really constrained because you can't give ODA money to a non-ODA country. But at the same time, and paper makes a good point, what if those countries become self-governing? How do we make sure we've got the right relationships? And I don't think there's an easy answer or any bucket of money in DFAT where they can find non-ODA money to give scholarships to French territory citizens. But it's a really interesting idea. I can see that it would be hard to find the bucket of money to make it work. That's like a boring bureaucratic answer, but it's tricky.
So I've got maybe 1 or 2 minutes left before we'll pass to Zoe. So I've got a question from Bill Richardson, just around a question of how can we, I guess, foster greater governance while simultaneously giving a voice to Indigenous knowledge from a small population base. I'm not 100% sure. I'm not familiar with the dichotomy of innovation versus institution by Clayton Christensen myself, but we do talk in the paper about the importance of continuing to foster the links that have already been built between Indigenous people and First Nations people in Australia and Indigenous people in the French territories in the Pacific in particular. I don't know if you wanted to add anything on that as well, Anna, or maybe you've picked up what I've missed in that question.
No, I'm sorry. I'm not sure I can really.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I think we'll call it a close on the questions. I'm really sorry one just came in there, but probably a little bit too late. I'm very sorry about that. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Zoe McKenzie, MP, the member for Flinders in the Commonwealth Parliament, and also the Deputy Chair of the Parliamentary Friends of France. Zoe and her colleagues hosted us last week at Parliament House for a kind of pre-launch of this paper with a number of her colleagues as well. So I just wanted to thank her again very much for that. And yeah, pass over to Zoe, who'll give us some remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh, and thank you especially Natalie, Anna and Kate. It's been fascinating to listen to you this afternoon. I pass on the regards of Jerome Laxal, who is again my colleague on the Parliamentary Friends of France. I'm relieved to say you've now got two quite French familiar leaders of the Parliamentary Friends of France, insofar as Jerome was French until he had to give up his citizenship a couple of months before the election, because we have that wonderful curveball of Section 44 of the Constitution. And I've been engaged in and around the French-Australian relationship for over 40 years and first lived in France 35 years ago. And so I feel like in some way I have seen it all in terms of the best and the worst of our bilateral relationship. May I thank you for this excellent report, which we did indeed have a briefing on last week, but also may I thank you for it because it is blunt, succinct, grammatically correct, which I really love about it, but equally it is thorough, honest and optimistic, which is the most important part. As I said, I think the first time I lived in France was a year or two before the real uptick in the nuclear tests in the Pacific. And it was a terrible time to be a Francophile and Francophone and to be missing that second version of home for which France has been for me since I was a child. And, I thought it couldn't, how to put it, we wouldn't have troubled days like that again. So you're right. When was it last year or the year before? When you have elections, your mind tends to get blurred. But it has been a big disruption, as you put it elegantly, Hugh, may I say, in the relationship. And I wasn't part of the government then, but I certainly followed it closely and had worked obviously in and around the bilateral relationship and the enormous energy it had precisely because of that deal. I recently went back to France. For those who are succession addicts like myself, you know that I'd offered myself up as a pain sponge. And may I say, I was so relieved to see the openness and generosity with which I was welcomed by government interlocutors across the board, diplomacy, the parliamentary officers and parliamentarians, Quai d'Orsay, everyone was, whilst disappointed, of course, absolutely keen to start talking about the future and what could be done. And that notion here that you talk about in the report of sort of, setting a more realistic expectation of each other and what that might mean. So that was fantastic. I can't say I got the same warmth from my family. My family slapped me around big time. So what are you people doing to us? Because of course, the naval and indeed nuclear submarine industry in France is something of which they are so deeply, deeply proud. And I did find at the time, even in my own household, my partner is an Argentinian, Canberran, Victorian, and he'd just say, mate, it's a contract. How can they get it? It's a contract. And I go, not for France. It's not a contract. It's a relationship. And it's had a different effect. So I was really pleased to say that in terms of government to government, that is making full steams ahead. And I think my family forgave me eventually after a good week of being in their company. But I still think as a country, we do have much more to do in terms of building that souplesse and that kind of comfort zone in that relationship between us. And I echo some of the observations made about closer relationships and particularly scholarships. I think going to France as a 15-year-old made me a card-carrying fan of the country ever since, even though, they occasionally drive me nuts too, as I'm sure we drive them. So that your report really does help people understand the level of enormous engagement by France in and around our region, the enormous investment in and around our region. But the thing I think we need to still work on is understanding one another culturally. Even after 35 years of back and forward, I still have time to go, really, why do they do it this way? And you see that, there were some of the references in this paper, I went off and read the original articles and went, oh yeah, no, we're not quite culturally simpatico just yet. That Anglo world and the French world does occasionally get a bit scratchy with each other. So we've still got a lot more work to do. So anything that can be done, government, but it doesn't even have to be government. None of my engagement with France was, oh no, that's not true, sorry. I did the Personnalité de l'Avenir program in 2008, which was an extraordinary experience. And insofar as France is still offering that in Australia, I say thank you. Please continue to do it. And equally, we recently had a delegation in Victoria from the Parisian region led by Valérie Pécresse, and they'd almost all done a DFAT sponsored trip to Australia at some point in time. And so they were really Australia capable and Australia excited. And so that was a wonderful experience as well. To give you some reassurance, the Parliamentary Friends of France is the busiest parliamentary friends group of all the ones with which I'm engaged. And I think I'm engaged with about half a dozen, including Germany, the EU and Argentina. And so France is the one kicking goals. We meet all the time. We had the Agence de Développement de France out recently. They were fantastic. And again, together with the mini launch we had last week, we had the ambassador for the Indo-Pacific. He spent 2 hours with us. It was absolutely fantastic. So it's a very, very busy group, a very eager group. I will throw in there more people on my side than Jerome's side, but that's because I've bullied them all into it. But they're all turning up. So there's a real hunger and interest in this relationship. So I hope that helps build your optimism and that this work is well placed, will be well read and well applied. So thank you from my perspective.
And thank you very much, Zoe. We thank you for your kind words and for how much you've been involved in this process. Really appreciate it. When we chose this topic 5 months ago, we thought it'd be an interesting time to focus on Australia-France, both on the barriers and problems, but also on the potential. And I think that the work that has come through the working groups meetings has really vindicated that. So I'd like to thank everyone who was involved in the working group. So obviously to those who've spoken today, to Natalie, to Kate, to Anna, but all of the working group members, and we'll put those in chat. I think we've got John on the line, Jules on the line, there may be more on the line, I can't see, but they all worked very hard to pull this together. To thank our advisory group and to thank all of the staff at AP4D. We try very hard to make these things look easy, but they're actually not. And that's a testament to the amazing talent of the people we have on the team. So huge thanks to Hugh, who has led this process, to Tom Barber, who makes it possible to communicate our results so broadly, and to everyone on the AP4D and broader ACFID team for making this possible. So if you found this interesting, we hope you will stay in touch. Stay in touch with us on social media. We've got a number of papers coming up. Probably the next one you'll see will be on maritime safety in the Pacific, the great seafaring region and what we can do on it. And we're looking forward to bringing out another paper looking at Australia as an infrastructure partner for Pacific and for Southeast Asia. So if you follow us, you'll see when those are, and we hope to stay in touch with you all. Thank you for joining us again today.